Hey there, and welcome to No Recipe Required. I'm Dave, and I hope you're doing well. So tonight I'm going to do a meatloaf for you. Now, meatloaf, there's thousands of different types of meatloaf. You can obviously change the meats. You can change the herbs. You can make the Italian meatloaf, make Mexican meatloaf. You kind of really do whatever you want. This one is really just pretty simple, classic meatloaf, pork and beef. We're going to do some bacon on top. We're going to do kind of the traditional tomato glaze, at least traditional in my house growing up. Let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, the first thing we're going to do for our meatloaf is to saute off some vegetables. I've got a nice hot pan here, and I'm going to add essentially the mirepoix. I've got carrot shredded. I've got a small diced onion, or a medium-sized diced onion, and I've got celery, about the same amount of celery and carrot in there. And I'm just going to let these vegetables come together, really soften up, start wilting, and this is going to help flavor our meat. I'm going to add it to the meat as we mix in some breadcrumbs and some eggs to kind of give everything the nice delicious flavor. I'm just going to salt my vegetables and let them cook down on medium heat for about 10 minutes. Okay, once the vegetables have softened up, you can just turn off the heat and let them cool down, and then we're going to add them to our meat along with everything else. Alright, let's go ahead and make our meatloaf. What I've got here, I'm using a mixture of pork and beef. For 2-3 people, I've got about 3/4 of a pound of each for 1.5 pounds of meat. I'm going to add in our cooled mirepoix. That's the onion, garlic, celery, and I'm forgetting the carrot. We're going to put that in there. Seasoning is important, so I'm going to add a good couple pinches of salt and pepper. And then to bind the meatloaf together, we're going to use some breadcrumbs. I've got, call that maybe 1/3 cup or so. We'll toss those in. And then I've also got a couple eggs that we get in there. Now finally, this is obviously the base, and you can take meatloaf in a ton of different directions. For our just kind of traditional classic, I've got some spices here, about 1 teaspoon each of some garlic powder, some chili powder, there's a little cumin in there, and oregano. Let me make sure we get all those guys in there. You can really use almost anything you want in here, and it's even with the vegetables. I've seen other people put in, put in spinach, put in mushrooms, really whatever you want. So now the goal is to mix this all together and get it homogenized. As you can see, just like to use my hands. I generally keep this hand free to move the bowl, get in there with one hand, and just mix everything together until it's well incorporated. And then once it is incorporated, I think a pretty key step, and I do this with my meatballs as well, is before we cook the entire meatloaf, and then find out maybe at the end, hey, it could have used a little more salt, could have used a little more pepper, a little more breadcrumbs. I like to form just a little tester like that, just a little piece of the meatloaf meat. Cook this off and give it a taste, and then that'll tell you, hey, should I add more salt? Should I add more pepper? Really important. It's going to save you, if not the first time, the second, third, or fourth time when you think you've got the seasoning right, but it just needed a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and once I do, I'll make any seasoning adjustments, and then we'll come back and show you how to form the meatloaf. Okay, so I just finished doing my little taste test, and I'm super glad I did, because my meatloaf was definitely under-seasoned. I just added a bunch more salt, and then mixed it up again. Now, to form it, I actually I don't really use a meatloaf pan. I just do the freeform method. And as you're mixing it up, I like to just kind of pull it over to one side of my mixing bowl here, and I've almost got my meatloaf shape. Just kind of pull it up out of that bowl, rubbing it against the sides, and you can get it up pretty much in one nice bowl there, or one nice big ball. And then you can certainly use a baking dish or a cookie sheet, anything like that. I just happen to be using a large skillet because for this meatloaf, it fits, it works. You can decide your ultimate size and shape based on your preference. I like it roughly I don't know, call that 4 or 5 inches square, and looks kind of like a football shape. You don't really need to pat it around too much. You just want to get it in that shape. And then I just put a little bit of olive oil down on my pan to help make sure it doesn't stick. And then I'll drop that right in there. My final step is to you want to try and make sure the sides don't taper off into flat ends and otherwise they're thinner, they'll get a little bit overcooked. Final step for me is actually to lay a little bit of delicious bacon right over the top. This is it's really just 2 strips of thickly sliced bacon. You can add more if you want. I don't know that you need to. I got a couple gaps in there. The bacon will get nice and crisp as it cooks, and obviously the flavor will just kind of seep down into that meat as well, make it absolutely delicious. I'm going to put this in an oven at about 400 degrees for probably half an hour to 40 minutes or so. A little tough to tell sometimes. If you've got a meat thermometer, I do. I like to put a meat thermometer in there, use that as my ultimate guide. So my meatloaf has been going now for about 15 minutes, and what I want to do, I love that tomato sauce that, again, is pretty traditional in my family along with meatloaf. So I'm going to start making that actually in the pan as the meatloaf is going. This is maybe 3/4 of a cup of pureed, actually it's whole tomatoes that I just squeezed the whole plum tomatoes and crushed them up. You could use pureed tomatoes if you want as well. You can skip this step altogether, frankly, as well. I'm going to take this and just dump it at the bottom of the pan and let the tomato just kind of cook down and roast a little bit, and that's going to form the base of our sauce. Okay, guys, so my meatloaf hit about 155 degrees. Took longer than I thought. It probably took like an hour or so, but that's totally fine. We just like a steak or any meat, we're going to let it rest, and while we let it rest, we're going to make our sauce. Our tomatoes have reduced down and combined with the meat juices in there, going to be absolutely delicious. Okay, so while our meatloaf rests, I've got our same pan I cooked the meat in. Now, if you happen to do this on a sheet pan, no problem. You do the exact same thing. Just scrape all that stuff into a saucepan, and you can follow the same procedure. To this tomato, I'm going to add a little bit of ketchup because ketchup is tasty. Probably a couple tablespoons in there, and I've got the heat on. I'm just going to let that kind of ketchup saute a little bit, get a little bit of color on it for a minute or two, and then I'm also going to add a couple jiggers of Worcestershire sauce and stir that in. And then finally, we're going to make this into more of a sauce consistency with a little bit of chicken stock. I'm just going to pour that right in and mix it together. I've got a whisk. You don't need to use a whisk. You use whatever you want. And then this is just going to reduce down and form our sauce. So you want to bring it up to a boil and let it thicken up. Okay, our sauce has now gotten to the consistency that I want it to. If you want it, if you want to keep reducing it, you absolutely can. If you need to, you can just add some water to thin it out. No problem. So let's go ahead and serve up our meatloaf. Okay, let's go ahead and serve up our meatloaf. This, as you can see, is not meatloaf. I've got a little mashed potato, actually cauliflower mashed potato, to serve along with it. I'm going to go maybe 1, 2 slices of our, classic little meatloaf right there. We've got our sauce that we can also spoon on there, either directly on top or kind of around the sides, and maybe a few carrots as well. And that is our classic comfort food meatloaf. And I will see you next time on No Recipe Required.